The morning whispers of Sweetwater Creek, Colorado, carried more than just the scent of pine and promise in the summer of 1876. They bore the weight of Henrietta Pierce's silence and the judgment that clung to it like morning dew on prairie grass. Her slender fingers trembled as she arranged pastries in the display case of her father's bakery. The only sound between them, the gentle clink of china, and the occasional grunt from the old man working the dough behind her. Henrietta hadn't spoken a word since the fever took her mother 3 years prior. At 22, she'd become the subject of whispers and sideways glances in town, the peculiar mute girl, who communicated through small nods, handwritten notes, and eyes that seemed to hold all the words she couldn't say. "You'll never find a husband if you don't speak up, girl," her father reminded her for the 1,000th time, flour dusting his already white beard. "No man wants a wife who can't even say I do at the altar." She lowered her gaze, used to the sting of such remarks. The bell above the door jingled, announcing the arrival of Mrs. Thornton and her daughters, the town's most notorious gossips. "Good morning, Mr. Pierce," Mrs. Thornton said cheerfully, purposely ignoring Henrietta. "3 loaves today, please." As her father turned to fetch the order, Mrs. Thornton's youngest daughter, Vivian, leaned across the counter. "Is it true you're just pretending? Mary Sanders says you talk to yourself at night when you think no one's listening." Henrietta's cheeks burned as she shook her head, keeping her eyes fixed on the counter. "Leave her be, Vivian," Mrs. Thornton said, though her tone held more curiosity than reprimand. "Poor thing probably dropped on her head as a baby. Some people are just born simple." The bell jangled again, and the bakery fell silent as a tall figure ducked through the doorframe. Henrietta recognized him immediately, the new rancher who'd bought the old Fletcher place last month. Rugged and sun-bronzed, he removed his hat, revealing chestnut hair that curled at the ends. The ladies' whispers shifted focus, appraising the newcomer with undisguised interest. "Morning, ladies," he nodded politely before approaching the counter. "Name's Riley Richardson. Heard this is the only place in 3 counties that makes decent sourdough." Mr. Pierce beamed with pride. "You heard right, son. I'll fetch you our best loaf." While her father disappeared into the back, Henrietta stood frozen behind the counter, pencil and paper ready for the stranger's order. When their eyes met, he smiled, not the pitying smile she'd grown accustomed to, but something genuine that reached his hazel eyes. "You must be the baker's daughter," he said, his voice low and warm like honey over gravel. She nodded, scribbling on her pad. "Henrietta Pierce." "Would you like anything else with your bread?" He read the note, his expression unchanged by her method of communication. "Just the bread today, Miss Pierce, though I'd be obliged if you'd recommend what goes best with it." Mrs. Thornton couldn't contain herself. "She doesn't talk, Mr. Richardson. Hasn't said a word in years. Most think she's touched in the head." Riley's eyes never left Henrietta's face. "Is that so? Well, I've known plenty of folks who talked too much and said nothing worth hearing." Henrietta's pulse quickened as she wrote, "Our raspberry preserves. Made them myself." "Sold," he replied, placing coins on the counter as Mr. Pierce returned with the bread, "and a jar of Miss Pierce's raspberry preserves." As Riley Richardson left the bakery, tipping his hat to Henrietta with a wink that the Thornton women surely noted, something shifted in the air around her. For the first time in years, her silence felt less like a burden and more like a choice. The next morning, Riley returned just before closing. The bakery was empty save for Henrietta, who was sweeping the floor while her father counted the day's earnings in the back room. "Miss Pierce," he greeted, hat in hand. "That sourdough was even better than advertised." She smiled, reaching for her pad and pencil. "No need for that just yet," he said softly. "I came to ask if you might consider a walk with me Sunday after church, if that suits you." Henrietta blinked in surprise. No one had ever courted her, not before the silence and certainly not after. She hesitated, then nodded slowly, her heart racing like a wild Mustang. "Perfect," Riley smiled. Oh, and those preserves might be the best thing I've ever tasted. For the rest of the week, Henrietta moved through her days with an unfamiliar lightness. Even the usual taunts from town folk seemed to bounce off her. On Saturday, she pressed her best dress and polished her only pair of good shoes. When Sunday came, she sat rigid in the church pew, acutely aware of Riley's presence 3 rows back, ignoring Reverend Mills's sermon about the sin of pride. After the service, as congregants filtered into the churchyard, Riley appeared at her side. "Ready for that walk, Miss Pierce?" Her father looked between them, surprise and skepticism battling across his weathered face. "You sure about this, Richardson? My girl's condition isn't going to improve with fresh air." "With all due respect, sir, I don't recall asking about any condition," Riley responded evenly. "Just requested the pleasure of your daughter's company for a walk." Henrietta slipped her arm through Riley's offered elbow, ignoring the stares and whispers that followed them down the dusty main street of Sweetwater Creek. They walked to the edge of town, where the buildings gave way to open plains dotted with wildflowers. Riley didn't press her to communicate, didn't fill the silence with uncomfortable chatter. Instead, he pointed out a hawk circling overhead, the first bluebonnets of the season, the way the distant mountains seemed purple in the afternoon light. When they reached a small creek, he helped her settle on a flat rock near the water's edge. "My mother went silent after my little brother died," Riley said suddenly, skipping a stone across the creek's surface. "Didn't speak for almost a year. Pa said she'd gone mad with grief, but I knew better. She spoke when she had something worth saying." Henrietta pulled out her pad. "People think silence means emptiness. But sometimes there are too many words, not too few." Riley read her note and nodded. "Exactly. Most folk are afraid of silence, makes them uncomfortable. They'd rather fill the air with nonsense than listen to what silence has to say." "Why aren't you afraid?" she wrote. "Because silence has its own voice," he said simply, "and yours speaks clearer than most." On their walk back to town, they encountered the Sanders brothers, 3 local troublemakers who'd made sport of Henrietta's condition more than once. "Well, look here," the oldest, Frank, called out. "The dummy found herself a beau." His brothers snickered as Frank stepped into their path. "Better watch yourself, Richardson. She might be pretty, but she's not right in the head. Can't even scream if you try something fresh." Before Henrietta could process what was happening, Riley had Frank by the collar, his voice deadly calm. "Apologize to the lady," Frank sneered. "Lady." "She's just a—" Riley's grip tightened. "I won't ask twice." Something in his eyes must have conveyed his seriousness, because Frank muttered an apology before the brothers skulked away. Riley adjusted his hat, seemingly unruffled by the confrontation. "Sorry about that," he said to Henrietta as they continued walking. "Some men mistake cruelty for strength." She touched his arm gently, her eyes conveying gratitude that needed no translation. Over the next few weeks, Sunday walks became a ritual. Sometimes they'd sit by the creek, other times explore the foothills beyond town. Riley taught her to skip stones and identify bird calls. She showed him where the sweetest wild strawberries grew and how to tell which clouds meant rain was coming. Word spread through town about the strange courtship between the mute baker's daughter and the handsome newcomer. Some found it romantic, others deemed it a scandal or worse, a cruel joke at Henrietta's expense. Her father warned her not to get her hopes up. "Men like him don't settle for girls like you," he said one night as they closed the bakery. "He'll move on when the novelty wears off." But Riley didn't move on. Instead, he appeared at the bakery one afternoon with a leather-bound book. "Found this in Denver last week," he explained, sliding it across the counter to Henrietta. "Thought you might like it." It was a journal, its pages blank and promising. Inside the cover he'd written, "For all the words that matter." That night, Henrietta filled the first pages with everything she wished she could say aloud. About how her voice had vanished the day they lowered her mother into the ground, how the doctor had found nothing physically wrong, how the silence had started as shock but became a fortress she couldn't find her way out of, even when she wanted to. She brought the journal on their next walk, letting Riley read what she'd written. When he finished, his eyes were soft with understanding. "Grief does strange things to people," he said. "Doesn't make you broken, Henrietta, just human." As summer turned to fall, Riley became a fixture in the Pierce bakery. He'd stop by in the mornings before heading to his ranch and again in the evenings, sometimes staying to help close up. Mr. Pierce's initial skepticism gradually softened as he witnessed the care Riley took with his daughter, not trying to fix her, just accepting her as she was. The town's treatment of Henrietta began to shift too. If the handsome, capable Riley Richardson valued her company, perhaps there was more to her than they'd assumed. The crueler taunts subsided, though whispers still followed her like shadows. One crisp October afternoon, as golden leaves spiraled down Main Street, Henrietta was delivering bread to the general store when she overheard Vivian Thornton speaking to the shopkeeper's wife. "It's pity, plain and simple," Vivian insisted. "My cousin in Denver says Riley Richardson comes from good stock. His family owns half the railroads in Colorado Territory. He could have any woman he wanted." "Then why's he sniffing around the mute girl?" the shopkeeper's wife asked. "Christian charity," Vivian replied smugly. "Or maybe he likes that she can't talk back. Men do prefer obedient wives." Henrietta slipped out before they noticed her, but their words lodged in her chest like thorns. By the time Riley arrived at the bakery that evening, doubt had bloomed fully within her. "Thought we might ride up to Whisper Ridge tomorrow," he suggested. "The aspens are turning. It's quite a sight." Instead of reaching for her pad, Henrietta handed him a folded note she'd prepared earlier. "I release you from whatever obligation you feel toward me. I won't be a charity case or a curiosity. You deserve someone whole." Riley read it twice, his brow furrowed. "Is this what you think? That I'm with you out of pity?" She couldn't meet his eyes, focusing instead on kneading the dough before her with unnecessary force. "Look at me, Henrietta," he said, his voice gentle but firm. When she finally did, he continued, "I've never pitied you, not once. I admire you. Your strength, your patience, the way you truly listen. Do you know how rare that is?" She shook her head slightly, tears threatening. "Your quiet is my song," Riley said simply. "It's restful and true in a world that's too often neither." That night, Henrietta dreamed of her mother not pale and still in her coffin, as she usually appeared in nightmares, but vibrant and smiling, hanging laundry in the backyard. In the dream, her mother turned to her and said clearly, "Your voice isn't lost, my love. It's waiting." She woke with tears on her cheeks but a curious lightness in her chest. The following day, Riley arrived with 2 horses. Mr. Pierce watched from the bakery door as his daughter mounted the gentle mare Riley had brought for her, her hands steady despite never having ridden before. Something like pride flickered across the old baker's face as he waved them off. The ride to Whisper Ridge took most of the morning. Henrietta followed Riley's lead, grateful for the docile nature of her mount. As they climbed higher into the foothills, the world opened up around them, valleys painted in autumn gold, crimson, and amber stretching to the horizon. At the ridge, they dismounted and Riley spread a blanket beneath a canopy of quaking aspens, their coin-shaped leaves shimmering in the breeze. He unpacked a lunch of bread, cheese, and apples, along with a flask of cider. "I come up here to think," he explained, surveying the panorama before them. "Something about seeing the world from above puts things in perspective." Henrietta nodded, understanding completely. From this height, Sweetwater Creek looked like a toy town, its problems and judgments too distant to touch her. They ate in companionable silence, the rustling leaves and occasional bird call the only soundtrack they needed. After lunch, Riley leaned back against a tree trunk, his hat tipped low over his eyes. Henrietta wandered a short distance away, drawn to a cliff edge that offered an even more spectacular view. The wind picked up suddenly, tugging at her skirts and hair. She closed her eyes, feeling the world move around her while she stood still at its center. Something was shifting inside her, two plates of emotion grinding against each other like the earth forming mountains. A strangled scream broke the silence. Henrietta whirled to see Riley struggling with a mountain lion that had emerged from the underbrush. The beast had him pinned, its massive paws on his chest as Riley held its snapping jaws away from his throat. Terror froze her for a split second before she was running toward them, grabbing a fallen branch along the way. Without thought, she swung it with all her might at the cat's side. The lion turned its attention to her, snarling. Riley used the distraction to reach for his knife, but the animal was already lunging toward Henrietta. "Run!" Riley shouted, struggling to his feet. Instead, she raised the branch again, her heart hammering against her ribs. As the mountain lion sprang, Riley threw himself between them, knife flashing. The beast's claws caught his shoulder, tearing through his shirt and flesh beneath. Riley cried out in pain but managed to drive the blade into the cat's side. The wounded animal retreated with an angry yowl, disappearing into the trees as quickly as it had appeared. Riley collapsed to his knees, blood seeping through his torn shirt. Henrietta rushed to him, tearing strips from her petticoat to staunch the bleeding. Her hands shook as she pressed the makeshift bandage against his wounds. "It's not as bad as it looks," Riley assured her through gritted teeth. "Just scratches." But Henrietta could see they were more than scratches. They needed to get back to town, to the doctor. Fear clutched at her throat as she helped Riley to his feet and toward his horse. What if he couldn't ride? What if the mountain lion returned? What if— The pressure in her chest built until it felt like she might shatter. As Riley stumbled, she steadied him, the words bursting from her before she could stop them. "Hold on to me." Her voice was rusty from disuse, barely more than a whisper, but it was there. Riley stared at her in shock, pain momentarily forgotten. "Henrietta." "We need to go," she said, each word feeling strange and new in her mouth. Now, the ride back to Sweetwater Creek was harrowing. Riley insisted on riding alone despite Henrietta's protests, though she could see how each movement caused him pain. She kept her horse close to his, watching for signs he might fall. By the time they reached town, Riley's face was ashen beneath his tan, his shirt soaked with blood. Henrietta rode ahead to alert the doctor, her sudden ability to speak causing almost as much commotion as Riley's injuries. "Mountain lion attack," she explained breathlessly to Dr. Wilson, who had known her since childhood and had never heard her voice. "Riley's hurt badly." The doctor recovered from his shock quickly, professional instincts taking over as Riley was carried into his surgery. Henrietta paced outside while the doctor cleaned and stitched the wounds, her newly rediscovered voice working overtime in prayer. When Dr. Wilson finally emerged, his expression was grim but not defeated. "He'll live, but those wounds need watching. Fever's the real danger now." Henrietta insisted on staying, sending word to her father about what had happened. Mr. Pierce arrived an hour later, bringing clean clothes for his daughter and food for the vigil ahead. "You're speaking," he said simply when they were alone, tears gathering in his eyes. "Yes," she replied. "It came back when I needed it." He squeezed her hand. "Your mother would be proud." For 3 days and nights, Henrietta barely left Riley's bedside. When fever took hold, she bathed his forehead with cool cloths and spooned broth between his cracked lips. When delirium made him thrash and cry out, she held his hand and spoke to him, her voice gaining strength and confidence with each passing hour. She told him stories about her childhood, about her mother's kindness and her father's strength. She read to him from books the doctor's wife brought. And when no one else was in the room, she sang the lullabies her mother had once sung to her, melodies she hadn't heard in years, but that lived in her bones. On the 4th morning, Riley's fever broke. He opened his eyes to find Henrietta dozing in a chair beside his bed, her hand still clasping his. The movement of his fingers tightening around hers woke her. "You're awake," she said, relief flooding her face. Riley stared at her in wonder. "It wasn't a dream then, you really spoke." "I did," she confirmed. "It seems I found my voice when I thought I might lose you." "And what a beautiful voice it is," he murmured, his free hand reaching up to touch her cheek. "Though I'd have loved you either way, Henrietta Pierce." The words hung between them, simple and profound. Neither seemed surprised by them. "I know," she whispered. "That's why I love you too." News of Henrietta's miraculous recovery of speech spread through Sweetwater Creek like wildfire, quickly overshadowing gossip about her relationship with Riley. Some claimed it was divine intervention. Others suggested the shock of the mountain lion attack had jolted her system back to normal. Dr. Wilson had a simpler explanation. The mind heals in its own time, in its own way. Miss Pierce spoke when she was ready to speak again. As Riley recovered, Henrietta divided her time between the bakery and his bedside. Each day, her voice grew stronger, though she remained selective with her words, preferring quality to quantity. The townsfolk who had once mocked her silence now marveled at the gentle thoughtfulness of her speech. By the first snowfall, Riley was well enough to return to his ranch, though Dr. Wilson advised against hard labor until spring. Henrietta rode out with him that first day, helping to settle him into the sturdy log house he'd built the previous summer. Standing in his front room, surrounded by simple but well-crafted furniture, Henrietta felt a sense of rightness that had eluded her for years. "It's beautiful," she said, running her hand along the mantelpiece. "It's lonely," Riley replied honestly. "Or it was until I met you." They married the following Sunday in the same church where they'd first walked out together. Henrietta wore a dress of deep blue with her mother's lace collar. When the time came to speak her vows, her voice rang out clear and true, bringing tears to her father's eyes and silencing the last of the town's skeptics. The bakery flourished under their joint care. Riley's business sense complemented Henrietta's baking skills, and they expanded to supply bread to neighboring towns. By spring, they had hired 2 assistants and were planning to add a dining area for serving coffee and pastries. When Mr. Pierce announced his intention to retire to a small cabin on their ranch property, no one was surprised. The old man had softened considerably since gaining a son-in-law who appreciated his sourdough and a daughter whose voice, when she chose to use it, brought music back into his life. A year after the mountain lion attack, Riley and Henrietta stood on the porch of their ranch house, watching the sun set behind the mountains. His arm encircled her expanding waistline where their first child grew. "Do you ever miss the silence?" he asked, his breath warm against her hair. Henrietta considered the question. "Sometimes," she admitted, "but now it's a choice, not a prison." "Your quiet or your words both are music to me," Riley said, "always have been." As twilight descended over Sweetwater Creek, Henrietta thought of all the paths that had led to this moment: grief and silence, mockery and acceptance, danger and courage. She had found her voice again, yes, but more importantly, she had found someone who loved her either way. "Dance with me," she said softly. And there on the porch, with no music but the wind in the pines and the distant howl of a coyote, they danced as stars appeared one by one above them, 2 people who had learned that sometimes the most profound conversations happen in the spaces between words, in the quiet that connects rather than divides. Years later, when their children asked how they fell in love, Riley would always smile and say the same thing. "Your mother's silence spoke to me first, and when she finally used her voice, it only confirmed what I already knew, that some songs don't need words to change your life forever." Henrietta would simply nod, her hand finding his across the table, the bond between them as strong and clear as the day she had broken through years of silence to save the man who had first seen value in her quiet. In a town that had once defined her by what she lacked, Henrietta Richardson became known instead for the fullness of her life: a successful business, a loving family, and a voice that, when raised in song or story, reminded everyone in Sweetwater Creek that healing comes in its own time, and that sometimes the greatest strength lies in being precisely who you are, whether in silence or in speech.